"Mom, I cleared your room. My wife's parents are moving in." The words hit me like a physical blow, sharper than any of the pains I'd been having since my surgery. I gripped the armrest of my favorite chair, the one where I'd spent countless peaceful afternoons, and forced myself to breathe. My son, Stephen, had always been a man of few words, but these were spoken with a finality that left no room for debate. He was telling me my life was over, my purpose, my home, my existence as I knew it, all gone. I could feel a coldness spreading through my chest, an icy numbness that had nothing to do with my illness. This wasn't just a conversation. It was an eviction notice delivered with the casual disregard of a business transaction. And as he spoke, all I could hear was the sound of a key turning in a lock, sealing me out forever. But my son didn't know what I'd changed. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Your support means the world to me. The call had come on a Tuesday at 6:30 in the morning, a time I normally spent drinking coffee, watching the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains from my kitchen window. But today, the coffee was cold, and the sunrise seemed to mock my shattered reality. I was alone, sitting in the quiet of a house that was no longer mine. Just last week, Stephen had been here, bringing me groceries and checking on me after my surgery. He'd told me to rest, that everything was handled. I thought it was kindness. I now understood it was convenience. He needed me out of the way so he could execute his plan without a fuss. My mind raced back over the last 8 months. The suddenness of Frank's passing had left me in a fog of grief. Frank had always been the planner, the rock of our family. He'd handled everything, from the finances to the yard work. All I had to do was love him and raise our son. After his death, I felt adrift, a ship without a captain. Stephen had stepped in, taking over the family business, or so I thought, and managing all of Frank's affairs. I signed everything he put in front of me, trusting my son completely. Why would I not? He was my boy. The boy I raised, the boy who used to run to me with skinned knees and broken dreams. Now, he was a man who wanted to take away my home. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. The grief had been a heavy blanket, but this new feeling, this cold betrayal, was like a bucket of ice water. It was a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I was not just a widow. I was Diane Miller. I had survived a difficult childhood. I had built a life with a man I loved. I had raised a son. I would not let a piece of paper, a condescending phone call, or a couple of suitcases define the final chapters of my story. There was a strength deep inside me, a quiet fire that I had forgotten existed. My gaze fell on the old wooden box on the mantelpiece, the one I used to keep Frank's old pocket watch in. It was a sentimental piece, a timepiece he'd always carried, a gift from his father on his 21st birthday. He'd never let me touch it. "It has its secrets, my love," he used to say. "Only open it when you're at your wit's end." I'd always thought it was one of his silly jokes, but in that moment, the words took on a new meaning. I stood up, my joints protesting, and walked over to the mantelpiece. The wood was smooth under my fingertips, a testament to years of quiet companionship. I opened the lid, and there it was, sitting on a velvet cushion. The watch was heavy in my palm. I noticed a small, almost invisible seam on the back. My fingers fumbled with it, my heart pounding in my chest. A small compartment popped open, revealing a tiny, worn piece of paper. The handwriting was Frank's, a familiar scrawl that sent a pang of nostalgia through me. The note was simple. "To my darling Diane, the truth is a key, the key to everything. The location is the only place you ever felt truly free." I stared at the words, my mind trying to make sense of them. What did Frank mean? Where was the only place I ever felt truly free? I had no idea, but something about his final message filled me with a determination I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about a key or a location. It was about something bigger, a legacy, something Stephen didn't know about. I looked around the room one last time. This house, these memories, this betrayal, it was all part of a chapter that was ending. My story was about to begin. The words on the tiny piece of paper felt like a riddle. The truth is a key, the key to everything. The location is the only place you ever felt truly free. I reread the note a dozen times, walking laps around the empty living room. The clock was ticking. Stephen was due to arrive later that afternoon to finalize the moving arrangements, which meant clearing out the rest of my personal things before the new owners, his in-laws, moved in. I needed to act fast, but where could I start? The only place you ever felt truly free. It wasn't this house, although I loved it. It was Frank's home too, and there were always responsibilities here. It wasn't the cabin in the mountains. That was peaceful, but not free. I closed my eyes, trying to transport myself back in time. When did I feel like the weight of the world was off my shoulders? Then it hit me. The racetrack. Frank and I had spent every Sunday morning for 40 years at the local dirt track, watching the amateur races. It was loud, messy, and totally unpretentious. Frank loved the grease, the noise, the sheer honest physicality of the engines. I loved watching Frank. And when I was there, surrounded by the roar of the crowd and the smell of fuel, I was simply Diane, not a wife, not a mother, just a spectator, yelling for the underdog. That was freedom. Frank had a small, anonymous safety deposit box at the First National Bank of Denver downtown, the bank closest to the track. He'd occasionally mentioned storing important paperwork there. I had a key to that box, a spare he insisted I keep just in case. I'd always filed it away and forgotten it, believing it held insurance papers or his old fishing license. I found the key hidden inside a sewing basket, wrapped in a faded handkerchief. It was heavy, made of tarnished brass, and looked much more substantial than the trivial items I imagined it guarded. I threw on a trench coat and sunglasses, feeling a ridiculous rush of adrenaline. I hadn't taken the bus downtown in years. Stephen had conveniently sold my old sedan to pay off some minor bills, leaving me dependent on him or ride-sharing. But today, I took the bus. The whole situation felt strange, theatrical, almost like I was an actress in a movie I hadn't auditioned for. The bank building was granite and marble, cold and imposing. The vault itself was heavy and silent. The teller, a young man with a polite, bored smile, led me back to the private viewing rooms. My hands were shaking slightly as he inserted my key and pulled out the box. I was expecting a few folders, maybe a binder. What I found was a heavy, old metal box. I carried it to a small oak table and took a deep breath before opening the lid. Inside, there were no bundles of cash, no diamond necklaces, but a stack of documents that made my head spin. The first was a certificate of ownership for an entity called DMS Holdings. I flipped through the next pages. There were deeds, not for one house, but for 3 properties in the most affluent suburbs of Denver, including one breathtakingly modern townhouse I'd always admired downtown. Then came bank certificates, not just simple savings accounts, but investment portfolios with numbers that seemed entirely fictional. I tried to focus, searching for an understandable dollar amount, but the figures were beyond my comprehension. Frank, my simple, hard-working Frank, the man who drove an old pickup truck and insisted on clipping coupons, was a very wealthy man. But the real shock came from the final document, stamped with a gold seal. It was a partnership agreement for Miller Logistics, the company Stephen was running. The document clearly stated that while Stephen was the managing director, the company was 75% owned by DMS Holdings. And DMS Holdings, according to the certificate, was entirely mine. Frank had been the silent owner, the financial architect, leaving Stephen in the dark. My son, who was currently clearing out my room and arranging for my forced retirement, wasn't the owner of the family business. He was just an employee, managing a subsidiary of his mother's empire. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach, but this time, it wasn't fear or grief. It was the dawning realization of power. Stephen thought he had stripped me of my dignity, but Frank had left me a quiet, devastating arsenal. I closed the box, a slow smile spreading across my face. It wasn't the smile of a broken widow. It was the smile of a woman holding all the cards. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed a lawyer who understood secrets. Finding a lawyer was going to be the tricky part. I needed someone who wasn't just good, but who understood the delicate art of playing the long game. This wasn't about legal documents. It was about orchestrating a very public, very painful private lesson for my son. I left the bank, feeling the heavy weight of the DMS Holdings file in my bag. The downtown streets, once anonymous, now felt full of possibilities. I bypassed my usual bus stop and hailed a cab, instructing the driver to take me to the financial district. I needed to see the names on the big glass buildings. Frank had told me once that the best lawyers were the ones you never heard of, working quietly on the top floors of skyscrapers. I recalled a name Frank had mentioned years ago, someone he'd used for a simple property deal, Mr. Graham. I found his firm listed in an old business directory, Graham and Associates. It sounded solid, respectable, and not flashy. Perfect. I called from a payphone at a coffee shop, wanting to keep my movements untraceable. I felt ridiculous, like a spy in a cheap movie, but the stakes were too high to be careless. I introduced myself as Mrs. Miller, scheduling an urgent consultation about my husband's estate. When I walked into the Graham and Associates office, I felt a world away from the dusty engine parts and simple bookkeeping Frank and I had shared. The lobby was all cool marble and muted tones, the kind of silence that whispered money. Mr. Graham, a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a reassuringly calm demeanor, invited me into his office. He listened patiently as I recounted the basic facts of my situation: my husband's passing, my son taking over the business, and the recent suggestion that I move out. I omitted the betrayal, choosing instead to focus on the legal questions surrounding the documents. I opened the file and pushed the DMS Holdings ownership certificate across his massive desk. "Mr. Graham," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "My late husband, Frank Miller, left me these. I need you to confirm their legitimacy, and, more importantly, I need you to confirm that I am the sole, undisputed owner of this company." Mr. Graham carefully put on his reading glasses. He spent a full 20 minutes meticulously examining every stamp, every signature, and every legal clause on the documents. The silence in the office stretched, thick with anticipation. He finally leaned back, removing his glasses. "Mrs. Miller," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly, "these documents are impeccable. Your husband, forgive me for saying this, was a genius of corporate structuring. DMS Holdings is a clean, legitimate shell corporation. You are the sole shareholder and the effective owner of all assets held by this entity." He then slid the Miller Logistics Partnership Agreement toward him. His eyebrows rose as he scanned the percentages. "This is fascinating," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Your son, Stephen Miller, holds a 25% stake, but the controlling 75% interest is clearly listed under DMS Holdings. This means, legally, Stephen works for you." I felt a surge of triumph, but kept my face carefully neutral. "And the properties and investment accounts listed here, are those also legitimate?" "Entirely. The value is substantial, Mrs. Miller. I estimate your net worth, conservatively, is well over $15 million USD. And that's before assessing the true value of Miller Logistics." I simply nodded, allowing the number to settle over the years of assumed struggle and thrift. "Now, the delicate part," I continued, leaning forward. "My son believes he is the struggling owner of Miller Logistics and that I am a frail, financially illiterate widow. He is using this belief to justify selling my current home and moving me into a retirement facility." Mr. Graham's expression hardened. "That would constitute fraud and potential elder abuse, Mrs. Miller. We can halt the sale of your house immediately and petition for Stephen's removal from the company." "No," I cut him off gently, but firmly. "I don't want a legal battle, Mr. Graham. I want a lesson in gratitude and honesty. I want to know exactly how deep Stephen is in trouble at Miller Logistics. I want to know about his debts, his partners, and most importantly, his wife's involvement. And I want all of this information funneled back to me, in secret. No one, especially Stephen, must know I am behind this. Not yet. I want him to believe he is facing his failures alone." Mr. Graham regarded me for a long moment, a genuine smile finally breaking through his professional reserve. "Mrs. Miller," he said, picking up his pen, "this isn't a lawsuit, this is strategy. I like your approach. We can certainly handle the necessary investigations discreetly. We will start by examining the logistics firm's recent financial activities and any personal loan liens against Stephen Miller. I suspect we'll find some very interesting numbers." "Excellent, Mr. Graham," I said, rising to leave. "Let the games begin." The first reports from Mr. Graham came in 3 days later. They were meticulous, detailed, and utterly damning. Stephen wasn't just struggling at Miller Logistics. He was systematically destroying it. I sat in my lonely temporary apartment, the one Stephen had so generously found for me, reading through the documents. It was a sterile, cramped place on the far side of town, filled with the smell of old cleaning solution and other people's problems. Stephen had given me the key with a patronizing pat on the shoulder, saying, "It's temporary, Mom, just until the house sells." He never once looked me in the eye. He didn't have to. In his mind, I was already a ghost. The report revealed that Stephen, believing he was the true owner and untouchable, had been making reckless decisions. He had invested heavily in a failing venture outside of Denver, attempting to expand Miller Logistics into an area he knew nothing about. He'd taken out a massive unsecured loan, forging signatures where necessary, and using the company's assets as collateral. The core issue, Mr. Graham's summary read, is a $750,000 USD unsecured loan from a private equity group known as the Ironclad Fund. Stephen has missed 2 payment deadlines. They are not known for their patience. They are, shall we say, aggressive in their collection methods. The Ironclad Fund. The name itself sounded ominous. This wasn't a bank. This was serious trouble. Stephen hadn't just made a mistake. He was sinking the entire operation Frank had built in secret. I felt a flash of genuine maternal panic. My son was heading toward a cliff. The urge to intervene immediately, to call Mr. Graham and tell him to pay off the debt and save Stephen, was overwhelming. But then I remembered the coldness of his voice, the look of contempt in his eyes when he spoke of the old furniture he planned to throw out, the casual cruelty of sending his own mother to a retirement home. He needed to understand the true cost of his arrogance. He needed to feel the heat before he could appreciate the rescue. I called Mr. Graham back. "I have a new directive," I told him. "I want you to discreetly acquire the $750,000 USD debt from the Ironclad Fund. Do it through a completely separate shell company, something untraceable back to DMS Holdings or to me personally. I want to become Stephen's new creditor." There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Miller, that is a highly unorthodox but brilliant move. You want to become his most aggressive creditor without his knowledge. That gives you complete control over his timeline and his immediate future." "Exactly," I confirmed. "I don't want him arrested, but I want him terrified. I want him to believe the walls are closing in." I then turned my attention to Jessica, Stephen's wife. I hadn't liked her from the moment they met. She was all polish and performance, constantly pushing Stephen to upgrade their life with money they didn't have. The private investigator's report on her was brief and chilling. Jessica wasn't just demanding, she was actively looking for an exit. She was meeting with divorce attorneys, attempting to shield her own considerable assets from Stephen's impending financial collapse. And she was, most disturbingly, encouraging her parents to buy out Stephen's minority stake in Miller Logistics at a fraction of its true value. I saw the whole picture clearly now. Stephen was the fool, but Jessica was the puppet master, ready to abandon him the moment the money dried up. And her parents, the ones moving into my house, were circling like vultures. I had to accelerate the timeline. I couldn't let Stephen get fully devoured by Jessica's family before the lesson was complete. I contacted Mr. Graham again. "I need you to send Stephen a highly official, highly aggressive letter. It needs to come from the new company that owns his debt. Give him a final 48-hour notice for the first payment. Threaten litigation and asset seizure. Use strong, legally intimidating language. I want him panicking." The next day, Stephen arrived at my apartment, unannounced, looking agitated. He had rings under his eyes and his expensive suit looked rumpled. This was not the arrogant man who had tried to discard me. This was a frightened boy. "Mom," he said, pacing my tiny living room, running a hand through his hair, "I need you to sign a power of attorney immediately. It's a formality, but it gives me the authority to finalize the sale of your house quickly. I need the liquidity." I watched him, pretending to be frail and confused. "Power of attorney, dear? What for? I don't understand these papers." "It's just legal stuff, Mom. I need the house sold to save the company. It's our legacy," he snapped, his voice rising in panic. I feigned reluctance, then signed the documents with a shaky hand, making sure he saw my apparent vulnerability. As he rushed out the door, already on the phone with his lawyer, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of disappointment in him. He hadn't asked if I was okay, if I needed money, or if I had enough food. He only cared about the papers. He didn't know that the money from the house sale, the money he desperately needed, was about to vanish into a legal black hole, held up by the very sophisticated property holding structure Frank had put in place years ago. The sale would go through, but the funds would be frozen in escrow, technically belonging to DMS Holdings, my company, until certain complex legal hurdles were cleared. The money would be gone, and Stephen would be left with only the massive debt, now owned by his mother. The stage was set. The spotlight was about to hit Stephen. I just needed to wait for the ironclad fund to send their devastating collection notice. And then, the lesson would truly begin. The next few days were a blur of calculated chaos. Stephen, still blissfully unaware that his mother was his secret adversary, was rushing the sale of the house. He saw me as a minor inconvenience, a necessary signature on the way to his financial salvation. Meanwhile, I was quietly orchestrating his total ruin. I spent most of my time in my grim little apartment, which I now referred to internally as the war room. I only left to meet Mr. Graham in discreet locations, far from the familiar streets of Denver. The lawyer was proving to be a true asset, executing my instructions with an almost surgical precision. The first major blow landed right on time. I received a brief, coded text message from Mr. Graham. Package delivered. Subject reaction expected within 12 hours. The package was the aggressive collection letter from Ironclad Acquisitions, the shell company now owning Stephen's $750,000 debt. It wasn't 12 hours. It was 8. Stephen burst into my apartment late that evening. He didn't knock. He just slammed the door open, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was holding a crumpled piece of paper that must have been the notice. His expensive tie was loose, and the polished veneer of the successful businessman had cracked completely. "Mom?" he gasped, leaning against the doorframe, trying to catch his breath. "Did you know anything about this? Did Dad? Did he have any connection to some kind of loan shark group?" I put on my best performance of confusion and fragility, peering at him over my reading glasses. "Loan sharks, dear? Stephen, please don't use that language. What on earth are you talking about? Did you get into some kind of trouble?" He pushed the paper into my hand. The text was brutal, demanding immediate payment, threatening not only foreclosure on the company's assets, but aggressive pursuit of personal guarantees. The language was cold, legally watertight, and designed to induce maximum terror. "They're not loan sharks, Mom. They're private equity. But they're ruthless," Stephen pleaded, his voice cracking. "They're threatening to freeze all of Miller Logistics' assets by the end of the week if I don't show proof of payment. I need the money from the house sale. I need it now." "But the house just sold, didn't it, honey?" I asked innocently. "Where is the money? I signed all the papers you asked for." Stephen ran both hands through his hair, his eyes darting around my tiny living room as if looking for a way out. "It's tied up. Stupid legal holdups on the escrow account. Something about a secondary lien Frank never cleared. It's going to take weeks to resolve. This letter gives me 48 hours. The lie about the secondary lien was my doing, of course. Frank had structured the property ownership so cleanly that any quick sale would immediately flag the funds, funneling them into DMS Holdings' legal structure and essentially freezing them until the dust settled. Stephen, blinded by panic and greed, had never taken the time to understand his father's genius. "Oh, Stephen, that sounds simply awful," I said, handing the notice back to him. I was careful not to show any trace of my actual knowledge, allowing only pity and concern to show in my expression. "Is there anyone at all who can help you?" This led him to his next mistake. "It's Jessica, Mom. She's being impossible. She knows I'm in trouble, and she's talking about divorce. Her parents, they're moving into your house, Mom. But they're using that leverage to force me to sell my remaining 25% of Miller Logistics to them for pennies on the dollar. They said if I don't agree by tomorrow, they'll let the whole thing collapse just to stick it to me." He was confessing everything, not out of remorse for what he did to me, but out of sheer desperation. He had put Jessica and her parents above his own mother, and now they were turning on him. The sheer poetic justice was almost unbearable. "So, your wife and her family are taking advantage of your misfortune, Stephen?" I asked, allowing a hint of sadness to enter my tone. "They're tearing me apart, Mom. They're using your house as bait. I lost everything because I trusted the wrong people," he wailed, sinking onto my worn sofa. "I'm so sorry, dear," I murmured, placing a hand gently on his knee, a comforting gesture that was now laced with strategy. "I don't have that kind of money, you know. All I have is my small Social Security check. I'm afraid I can't help you financially." He didn't even notice the lie. He just nodded miserably, already lost in his own spiral of fear. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here. I don't know where else to go. They're coming after me. They're going to seize everything." He didn't know that I was the one coming after him. He didn't know that the beautiful house he and Jessica were renovating was already legally compromised. And he didn't know that the ruthless creditor he feared most was sitting right next to him, pretending to be a frail, defenseless old woman. I let him sit there in his despair for a few more minutes, soaking in the consequences of his actions. He finally stood up, muttered a rushed goodbye, and left, the frightened boy swallowed by the darkening city streets. The next phase of my plan was ready. Stephen had hit the bottom, but he hadn't yet started digging. I needed to remove his last safety net, the house itself. I called Mr. Graham immediately. "It's time for the final notice," I instructed him. "I want an eviction notice delivered to Stephen Miller and Jessica Miller. It needs to be from F&D Properties, the company that now holds the house's legal title. Give them 48 hours to vacate, no exceptions." F&D Properties, of course, stood for Frank and Diane. The ultimate betrayal was about to be served in the form of a legal document, demanding he vacate the very room he had stolen from his own mother. The house sale was moving forward, but the money was effectively locked away, thanks to Frank's genius legal work. Stephen was scrambling, frantic to plug the debt hole that I, his own mother, had created. But the true masterpiece of the moment was the eviction notice, delivered by a solemn process server on Friday afternoon. I knew the moment it happened. I was in my small apartment, carefully sorting through old photographs of Frank and Stephen, when my phone vibrated. It was Mr. Graham's brief confirmation. "Package 2 delivered. Recommend turning off mobile for 24 hours. I didn't need to turn off my mobile. I needed to witness the reaction. I was ready for a call, a panicked text, anything. What I got was much more satisfying. It started with a scream, distant but unmistakable. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose life revolved around watching the comings and goings of the neighborhood, called me 20 minutes later. "Diane, honey, you will not believe what is happening at your old place. That daughter-in-law of yours, Jessica, she is having an absolute meltdown. She's out on the curb, screaming at the man who gave her a piece of paper. She looks like a banshee." I offered a sympathetic sigh, keeping my voice gentle. "Oh dear. I hope they're all right, Henderson. Stephen is under a lot of pressure with the business." "Pressure?" That man in the suit, the legal fellow, he told her she has 48 hours to vacate. 48 hours, Diane. And she was screaming something about F&D Properties. "Who are they?" "I have no idea, honey," I lied smoothly. "I suppose that's the trouble with big corporate sales. Just pray for them, won't you?" I hung up, a slow, deep breath of satisfaction filling my lungs. Jessica, the architect of my misery, was experiencing the very definition of poetic justice. She was being evicted from the home she'd stolen, the home she had planned to fill with her own parents, all because of an innocuous shell company named after Frank and me. The silence that followed from Stephen was the most telling part. He didn't call me that night. He didn't come running to his supposed helpless mother. He was too consumed by his own crisis. He had reached the point of no return, where his survival instincts overrode all familial responsibility. He was truly alone. The next afternoon, I risked a visit to the old neighborhood. I drove past slowly in a rideshare, adopting a look of quiet, sorrowful curiosity. My old home was a scene of domestic chaos. My beautiful rose bushes were trampled, and the porch was littered with moving boxes. Jessica was arguing fiercely on the phone, while Stephen was standing motionless by the curb, staring blankly at the eviction notice still taped to the front door. He looked utterly defeated. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a cheap hoodie, and the arrogance had been replaced by genuine, gut-wrenching terror. I recognized the depth of his despair. It was the same despair I had felt on the doctor's waiting room chair, the day he called to discard me. I had to resist the urge to stop the car, to embrace him and tell him the game was over. Not yet. He hadn't truly faced his failures. Mr. Graham's next report arrived via secure email, detailing Stephen's desperate search for alternative financing. He had gone to 3 different loan brokers, pitching increasingly ridiculous schemes, only to be rejected because of the massive debt owed to Ironclad Acquisitions. Stephen Miller's credit profile is toxic, the report summarized. He is financially cornered, Mrs. Miller. Furthermore, Jessica Miller has filed for an emergency divorce and has successfully shielded her personal investment accounts. She is gone, taking a considerable amount of Stephen's personal savings with her. Stephen had truly lost everything: his home, his wife, his perceived status, and the immediate future of the company he thought he controlled. He was financially ruined and emotionally isolated. The time for quiet strategy was over. It was time for the final, most brutal part of the lesson: the direct confrontation, where I would offer him a chance at redemption, but only on my terms. I drove to a local Greasy Spoon diner, the kind of place Frank and I used to go to after the racetrack. It was noisy and anonymous. I found a booth in the corner, ordered a simple cup of black coffee, and waited. I didn't call him. I sent a single, simple text message from an unregistered phone Mr. Graham had provided. It contained only the address of the diner and the words, "Come alone. Be here at 4 p.m. Your mother." The anticipation was a physical thrumming in my chest. This wasn't just revenge, it was an intervention. I wasn't saving his assets, I was saving his soul. I knew that the man who would walk through that door would be broken. My job was not to shatter him further, but to show him the pieces and teach him how to glue them back together, one honest piece at a time. The fate of Miller Logistics, and more importantly, the fate of my relationship with my son, rested on his next 30 minutes. Stephen was late. I sat in the corner booth, watching the minutes tick by on the diner's old clock. 4:05, 4:10, 4:20. The place was filling up with the after-work crowd, a steady hum of conversation and the clatter of plates. A waitress came by and refilled my coffee for the third time, her expression a mix of pity and curiosity. Finally, at 4:35, the door opened and Stephen walked in. He looked completely different. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were hollow, and his hair was a mess. He was wearing the same hoodie from the day before, and it looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He scanned the room, his gaze frantic, until he saw me. He walked over to the booth, his movements slow and defeated. He didn't sit down immediately. He just stood there, looking at me, at the frail woman he had so easily discarded. "Mom," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What do you want?" "Sit down, Stephen," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You look terrible." He slid into the booth across from me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes. "I know what's happening," I said, deciding to cut straight to the chase. "I know about the eviction notice. I know about Jessica leaving. I know about the debt." He flinched. How? How do you know all that?" "You told me, Stephen. You came here the other day and told me everything." He was silent for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was remembering his desperate confession in my apartment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why did you ask me to come here?" "Because you're my son, Stephen, and I think you're in a great deal of trouble." He scoffed, a bitter, broken sound. "Trouble? That's an understatement, Mom. I'm ruined. I've lost everything." "Tell me what you did, Stephen. All of it. Don't leave anything out." He hesitated for a moment, but then the dam broke. He told me everything, the whole sordid story. He talked about his arrogance, his belief that he could turn Miller Logistics into a corporate empire without any real knowledge of the business. He talked about Jessica's constant pressure for a more luxurious life, a life he couldn't afford. He confessed to taking out the high-interest loan from Ironclad Acquisitions, a move he now knew was a fatal mistake. He admitted to forging my signature on the power of attorney. He even admitted that he had wanted to get rid of me to make room for Jessica's parents, hoping that their influence would save his business. He spoke with a raw honesty I hadn't heard from him in years. He was a man who had hit rock bottom, and he was finally ready to admit it. When he finished, he sat back, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I was so arrogant. I thought I knew everything, and now I have nothing. I've lost the business. I've lost my wife. I've lost my home. And worst of all, I've lost you." I reached across the table and took his hand. It was cold and clammy, but I held it tightly. "You haven't lost me, Stephen. Not yet. But you have to tell me one more thing. Do you want to fix this? Not for the money, not for the business, but for yourself?" Do you want to be the man I know you can be? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a new kind of tears. Not tears of self-pity, but tears of hope. More than anything, Mom, I'll do anything. I need a way out. I can't give you money, Stephen. I don't have it. But I can give you something else. I can give you a path, a way to learn from your mistakes and start over. He stared at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. A path? What are you talking about? I've arranged a meeting for you. At a place you know well. Be there tomorrow morning at 9, dress appropriately. And don't tell anyone. Don't tell a soul. He nodded, a glimmer of the old Stephen returning to his eyes. A glimmer of a man who was desperate to save himself. Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This isn't a favor, Stephen. This is an education you should have gotten a long time ago. The tuition is high, but the reward is priceless. He finally let go of my hand, a small, hopeful smile on his face. He didn't ask what I meant. He just accepted it, his pride broken, his spirit humbled. He had finally reached the point where he was willing to do whatever it took to redeem himself. The game was no longer about money and power. It was about something much more valuable. It was about family. It was about redemption. And it was about a son finally learning to respect the woman who had always had his back, even when he had turned his back on her. He stood up, gave me a small, grateful nod, and walked out of the diner, a changed man. The road to redemption had just begun. The next morning, I was already dressed and waiting by the door of my dreary apartment at 8:45 a.m. I didn't need to be at the meeting place until 9, but the anticipation was humming through my veins. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the final setup for Stephen's re-education program. I had chosen the location carefully. It wasn't some neutral territory like a lawyer's office. It was the vast, echoing warehouse district that housed Miller Logistics, the company Stephen thought he owned, the empire he was so carelessly demolishing. I arrived exactly at 8:58 a.m. and parked the rideshare across the street, keeping a discreet distance. I watched the clock. At 9 o'clock sharp, Stephen pulled up. He was driving the old Ford pickup Frank had kept as a relic, a testament to his simple roots. Stephen had probably sold his own luxury sedan to pay some small, desperate bill. Seeing him in that truck, the one Frank used to haul equipment, gave me a strange, complicated feeling of pride and sorrow. Stephen got out, looking around nervously. He was dressed in a clean, but clearly cheap suit he must have dug out of storage. He was ready for a job interview, a plea, anything that resembled a lifeline. He walked toward the main entrance, but an unfamiliar, uniformed security guard stopped him. Stephen argued, pointing at the logo on the building, clearly stating his name and title. The guard was unmoved. Stephen was just another visitor, another nobody. I watched as Stephen, defeated, turned and walked back toward the parking lot, his shoulders slumping. He pulled out his phone, ready to call me in a panic. But just as he brought the phone to his ear, a black sedan pulled up beside him. 3 men got out. They were all dressed in identical, dark, expensive suits, the kind of attire that screamed authority and trouble simultaneously. They didn't look like police or lawyers. They looked like collectors. Stephen froze. He clearly recognized them, or at least recognized what they represented. The lead man, tall and menacing, didn't raise his voice. He simply held out a folded paper. Stephen Miller, we've been looking for you. You missed the 48-hour payment deadline. This is a preliminary notice of personal asset seizure. Stephen's eyes widened in horror. Wait, you're from Ironclad. I'm trying to liquidate assets. The house sale is almost through. I can get you the money soon. The man gave a dry, humorless laugh. The time for almost through is over, Mr. Miller. We have a legal judgment to seize any personal assets that can quickly cover the $750,000 you owe. Your company, Miller Logistics, is already under corporate restructuring. We're here for the personal guarantee. Stephen began to plead, his voice cracking. Please, I have nothing. My wife left me. I'm being evicted. I'm ruined. Ruin is relative, Mr. Miller, the man replied, his tone chillingly professional. We believe the collection of your personal assets will commence immediately. The 2 men flanking him moved closer, not touching him, but boxing him in. Stephen was utterly, visibly terrified. This was the fear I had been aiming for, the fear of losing everything, the true, naked consequence of his reckless greed. He was helpless, staring down the barrel of financial annihilation. The climax of the confrontation was brutal. Stephen finally broke down, begging them to reconsider. The dark-suited men remained impassive, delivering their final ultimatum. "You have one chance, Mr. Miller. There is a man waiting for you inside the main administrative office. He says he can save you. Go now, or face the consequences." They pointed toward the building entrance. Stephen, shaking and confused, stumbled toward the door, not even looking back at the ominous sedan. He had no idea he had just had a terrifying, staged meeting with 3 actors hired by his mother, financed through DMS Holdings. The whole encounter was a calculated piece of theater designed to shatter his pride and make him utterly pliable. I gave the scene a few more minutes to breathe, allowing Stephen to reach the administrative office where his final test awaited. He was now a blank slate, desperate for rescue, no longer the arrogant prince. I then contacted Mr. Graham. "The subject is inside the building," I confirmed. "The setup is complete. Send in the management team. It's time for his new job to begin." I drove away from Miller Logistics, leaving Stephen to face his fate. His new bosses were waiting for him. They weren't just managers. They were the very people he had carelessly fired when he first took over the company, believing them to be expendable. They were the ones who would teach him the real cost of labor and the true meaning of respect. His education had just begun. Stephen stumbled into the administrative office, his mind reeling from the encounter with the so-called collectors. He was shaking, convinced he had narrowly escaped financial ruin, only to face a final, desperate plea for help. He expected to see some high-powered, cynical lawyer ready to offer him a lifeline in exchange for what little control he had left. Instead, he found a conference room occupied by 3 people. None of them wore suits. They were dressed in functional, clean work shirts bearing the faded logo of Miller Logistics. Stephen's eyes widened in disbelief. The woman sitting at the head of the table was Maria Sanchez, the chief dispatch manager he had summarily fired 6 months ago, claiming her old-school methods were slowing down modernization. Next to her was Walt Jenkins, the head mechanic who had run the company's garage for 20 years until Stephen dismissed him to outsource repairs. The third man was Kevin from accounting, whom Stephen had replaced with a junior analyst because Kevin dared to question his reckless borrowing. The shock of seeing them was almost greater than the terror of the debt collectors. "What is this?" Stephen stammered, pointing at them. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." Maria Sanchez leaned forward, her expression a mix of weary professionalism and quiet disdain. "Take a seat, Mr. Miller. This is your private meeting. And trust me, you are the last person we wanted to see today." Stephen stood, rigid with a mixture of fear and the last vestiges of his shattered arrogance. "I don't understand. Get out. I'm the managing director of this company." Walt Jenkins gave a short, hard laugh. "Not anymore, you're not. You're simply the one who ran it into the ground, son. We're here because we've been hired to run the corporate restructuring that those gentlemen from Ironclad were talking about." "Hired by who?" Stephen demanded, desperately looking for an enemy, a face to fight. "By the real owner, Mr. Miller," Kevin, the accountant, replied dryly. He pushed a manila folder across the table. "I suggest you read this. It outlines your new position. Or rather, your only position." Stephen snatched the folder. His hands trembled as he opened it. The document wasn't a contract, but a letter of engagement. It stated that due to catastrophic financial mismanagement, the previous managing director was being relieved of all duties. It then offered him a temporary, non-management position with Miller Logistics under the new administration. He scanned the page, looking for a title, an office, anything familiar. There was none. Under job title, the word was stark and unforgiving: trainee. Under responsibilities, it listed maintenance, cleaning the loading docks, and working the night shift sorting packages. Under salary, it listed a minimum wage with no benefits. Stephen threw the paper back on the table. "Minimum wage? Cleaning docks? This is ridiculous. I'm Stephen Miller. I'm Frank Miller's son. This is an insult. I won't do it." Maria looked at him, her eyes steady and cold. "You won't do it? Mr. Miller, you owe $750,000 to some very aggressive people. They are seizing every personal asset you own. Your house is gone, your wife is gone. You are financially toxic. This job is your only lifeline, your only chance to prove you are worthy of carrying the Miller name, which, by the way, belongs to the actual owner of this company. Who is the owner? Stephen whispered, the fight draining out of him. Who is behind this? Maria just shook her head. That's not your concern. Your concern is showing up for the night shift at 11 p.m. If you don't, we notify your creditors that you have refused the last-ditch attempt at self-rehabilitation. And then, trust me, the men in dark suits will be the least of your problems. She slid another piece of paper across. It was the debt notice from Ironclad, only this one had a handwritten note at the bottom. This notice is held in abeyance pending proof of honest, sustained labor. Stephen realized with sickening clarity that these three people, whom he had discarded without a thought, were now his only hope. They held the key to his debt. They held the key to his future. He was completely at their mercy. He slumped into the chair, defeated. And if I do this? If I clean the docks and sort packages? What then? Kevin leaned in, his voice low and serious. Then, and only then, after you've learned the value of $1 and the meaning of honest work, will we consider the next step. Until then, you are simply a laborer. Welcome to Miller Logistics, Stephen. Your first task is to report to the loading bay. They need help scrubbing the oil from the concrete floor. Stephen looked down at his ruined suit, then back at the faces of the people who now controlled his destiny. The humiliation was profound, but beneath it, a tiny ember of survival flickered. He stood up, picked up his folder, and walked toward the door that led to the noisy, working heart of the warehouse. He had no idea how deeply his mother's silent, loving hand guided every step of his humiliating descent. All he knew was that he was finally working for his life. The humiliation of cleaning oil from the warehouse floor was a bitter pill Stephen had to swallow. For the first 2 weeks, he was sullen, miserable, and constantly trying to pull rank, only to be shut down immediately by Maria, Walt, and Kevin, the three people he now reported to. They didn't just give him busy work. They gave him the hardest, dirtiest jobs, making him feel the weight of every minimum wage hour. He lived in constant fear. The eviction had forced him into a cheap, extended-stay motel on the outskirts of the city. He ate ramen noodles, his nice clothes were either stained or pawned, and his phone was constantly ringing with calls from lawyers chasing Jessica's debt or debt collectors from Ironclad Acquisitions who still hadn't fully backed off. He was a refugee in his own city, but slowly, something shifted. It started with Walt, the head mechanic. One night, while Stephen was struggling to fix a broken conveyor belt with tools he barely understood, Walt walked over. "You're doing it wrong, Miller," Walt grumbled, watching Stephen fumble. "You're trying to brute force it. That's why your business failed. You pushed too hard when you should be thinking smarter." Walt didn't offer sympathy. He offered a lesson. He showed Stephen how to properly torque the bolt, how to listen to the machine's rhythm. For the first time, Stephen wasn't being ordered around. He was being taught. And he realized these people weren't vengeful. They were simply competent. They respected the work, and they respected anyone who tried to learn it. He started asking questions. Simple questions about the dispatch routes, about inventory management, about the best way to load a truck to maximize fuel efficiency. Maria, who had run the dispatch desk for 2 decades, saw the genuine curiosity behind the former arrogance. She started to teach him the logistics of the road, the complex puzzle of moving freight across the country. "Your father knew this stuff inside and out," Maria told him one cold morning, showing him a hand-drawn map. "He never forgot where the real money was, in the details. You just looked at the big numbers." Stephen's former contempt for them evaporated, replaced by deep respect. These were the people who knew the heart of the business, the essential truth of its operation. He was learning more in a month cleaning toilets than he had in 2 years sitting in the CEO chair. During this time, I watched him from a distance. Mr. Graham's reports confirmed the change. Stephen wasn't trying to scheme or escape. He was working. He was clocking overtime. He even started using his minimal paycheck to buy lunch for the crew. The true test came 2 weeks into his probation. The old Miller Logistics building, the one Stephen had been evicted from, was due for a final inspection before F&D Properties finalized its new usage plan. Stephen was called into Kevin's makeshift office. Kevin, the accountant, didn't look up from his spreadsheet. "Mr. Miller," Kevin said, his voice flat. "The old property is sitting empty. It needs to be thoroughly cleaned out. There are still boxes of old files, junk, and personal effects. It's too much for the regular cleaning crew. You're going. Stephen swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. He had to go back to the house he grew up in, the house he had given away, and clean up his own mess. I understand, Stephen said quietly. When do I start? Tonight. You have the keys. Maria needs the job done by sunrise. That night, Stephen drove the old Ford pickup to his former neighborhood. The lights were off, the house dark and silent. He opened the front door with his key, the key he now used for labor, not luxury. He walked through the empty rooms, the echoing silence a constant reminder of his failure. The walls were scarred from Jessica's hasty redecorating. The smell of fresh paint mixed horribly with the scent of emptiness. When he walked into what used to be my room, his mother's room, he stopped. The room was completely bare. Jessica had cleared out everything. He imagined the coldness of his own actions clearing out my things, telling me my life was over. The image hit him harder than any debt notice. He hadn't just lost a house, he had destroyed a home. Then, in the corner of the room, he saw something. A small, dark smudge on the pristine hardwood floor. He knelt down and ran his finger over it. It wasn't dirt. It was a faint, almost invisible circle of dried wax. He remembered. That was where the old, simple wooden cabinet stood. The one Frank had built for me when I got sick. The one Stephen had scoffed at and told me to throw away. It was gone. He spent the next 6 hours doing the most thorough, humiliating cleanup of his life, sweeping up his own dust, packaging the remains of his past. He wasn't just scrubbing floors. He was scrubbing his conscience. As the sun began to rise, Stephen sat exhausted on the empty stairs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't call a broker. He called a single number he hadn't dialed in months. It was my number. When I answered, my voice was soft, sleepy. Hello? Mom. Stephen's voice was low, raw, and weary. I cleared the room. I finally understand. I am so sorry. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for rescue. He didn't even mention the eviction. He simply apologized for the deepest wrong he had committed. It was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment the old Stephen truly died. I know, honey, I said. A wave of relief and deep, complicated love washing over me. I know. Meet me at Mr. Graham's office tomorrow at noon. We have a lot to talk about. It was exactly noon when Stephen walked into the magnificent lobby of Graham & Associates. This time, he wasn't wearing a cheap suit. He was wearing the same worn hoodie and jeans he'd worn to clean the docks. But there was a new kind of dignity in his posture. He was tired, but he was present. Mr. Graham met him in the reception area, a small, knowing smile on his face. Mr. Miller, good to see you again. Your mother is waiting. The lawyer led Stephen through the silent corridors to a large conference room. The room overlooked the city skyline, the very view that Frank and I had always loved. I was sitting at the head of the polished table, holding the leather-bound file that contained the entire truth. Stephen walked in and stopped short. He looked from me to Mr. Graham, then back to me. He didn't look angry. He looked nervous, like a student waiting for a final grade. Mom, he began, his voice still hoarse from his early morning work shift. I hope you know I didn't come here for the money. I came here because I owe you an apology that just words can't cover. I understand what I did to you now. I was selfish, arrogant, and I tried to erase you from my life. I let him stand there for a moment, absorbing the weight of his own words. Then, I gestured to the chair beside me. Sit down, Stephen. It's time you understood exactly what you did. He sat, and I opened the file. Stephen, you thought you were the owner of Miller Logistics. You thought you were saving your company by selling my house. You believed you were smart enough to outmaneuver Frank's legacy. I slid the documents across the table, the certificate of ownership and the Miller Logistics partnership agreement. Stephen picked them up, his eyes flying over the text. He recognized the company names, but he didn't understand the structure. I don't see what this changes. It still says I had 25%, he stammered. Look closer at the 75%, Stephen, I instructed, my voice unwavering. That majority stake belongs to DMS Holdings. Do you know what DMS Holdings is? Stephen shook his head, utterly bewildered. It stands for Diane Miller Sterling, Stephen, I said, hitting him with the truth. It's my company. It has always been my company. Your father, Frank, built this entire financial fortress in my name, and he left it to me, not to you. You were never the owner. You were the manager. You were the employee. Stephen stared at the papers, his face draining of color. The look of utter, total shock was everything I had anticipated. It was the moment the ground vanished beneath his feet. You mean you knew? He whispered. You knew I was trying to sell the house? You knew I was facing bankruptcy? You knew I was sleeping in a motel and cleaning the docks? Yes, Stephen. I knew all of it, I confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. I knew the day you called me to say you cleared out my room. I found Frank's file shortly after. I've known the truth for months. I then motioned to Mr. Graham, who slid a third, thicker file across the table. Stephen, this file details every step of my intervention, I continued. The men from Ironclad Acquisitions, the ones who terrified you in the parking lot? They were actors, hired by a legal entity that had purchased your debt. I own your debt, Stephen. The terrifying creditor you thought was going to ruin you was simply your mother, setting a trap. Stephen leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The enormity of the deception was settling in. The eviction notice, the house. The house sale was frozen, tied up in legal maneuvers by Frank's own sophisticated planning, I explained. The money never went through. The house is legally mine, held by F&D Properties, named after your father and me. You were evicted from your own home, by your own mother, to teach you the cost of homelessness. Tears welled up in Stephen's eyes, not from sorrow, but from the dizzying, brilliant scope of the plan. Why, Mom? He asked, his voice filled with a desperate need for understanding. If you had the power to stop it, if you had all this money, why did you let me go through all of that? Because, Stephen, you needed to learn two things you couldn't learn in a corner office. First, the value of true labor. The people you fired, Maria, Walt, Kevin, they were the ones keeping this company afloat, not your flashy deals. You needed to work for them, to respect them, to learn their value. I paused, letting that sink in. And second, I finished, my voice softening just slightly. You needed to learn the value of family. When you had everything, you discarded me. When you lost everything, I was the only person you called. Frank didn't just leave you a company, Stephen. He left you a test. He left you a woman who was smart enough to hold this empire and strong enough to teach his son a lesson he desperately needed. I didn't save your assets, Stephen. I saved your soul. Stephen slumped forward, resting his forehead on the conference table. He wasn't crying anymore. He was processing. After a long minute, he lifted his head, his eyes red, but clear. What happens now, Mom? He asked. What do I have to do to earn your forgiveness? What's the cost? The cost is honesty, Stephen, I told him, pushing the final document across. Mr. Graham has prepared the papers to clear your debt completely. You are free of the $750,000. But the cost of your redemption is this. You will return to Miller Logistics, not as an owner, but as a worker. You will work under Maria, Walt, and Kevin for 1 full year. You will earn their respect, and you will rebuild the company from the ground up, using the knowledge they gave you. If you succeed, then we can talk about the future of the Miller name. Stephen picked up the papers. He didn't immediately sign the debt release. He looked at me, a genuine, humble smile finally breaking through the ruins of his former self. I accept the job, Mom. I'll clean the docks for as long as it takes. Thank you. 1 year passed. The change in Stephen was nothing short of miraculous. He was still working at Miller Logistics, but no one called him trainee anymore. He had earned his way back up, not by decree, but by sweat and genuine competence. He had served his time cleaning the loading docks, fixing the sputtering engines alongside Walt, and mastering the complex logistical routes with Maria. He showed up early, stayed late, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the value of his own effort. He had moved out of the bleak motel into a small, clean apartment, paid for with the honest wages he earned. He was still paying me back, slowly and meticulously, for the debt I had cleared. He didn't know the money just went into a separate account under my name, untouched. He only knew he had a debt of honor to repay. One sunny afternoon, I met Stephen at a small park near my temporary apartment. I was moving back to my own house, which Mr. Graham had officially cleared of all legal issues. The house was now legally mine, free and clear, protected by Frank's sophisticated structuring. Stephen brought me a small, carefully wrapped package. Mom, he said, handing it to me. I want you to have this. It's not much, but I earned it. I opened it. Inside was a small, simple wooden jewelry box, exactly the size and shape of the one he had tried to throw away from my room a year ago. "I built it myself," he confessed, a flush creeping up his neck. "Walt taught me how to use the shop tools. It's not fancy, but it's strong. I wanted you to have a safe place for your most important things." Tears pricked my eyes. It wasn't the material gift. It was the love and humility the box represented. "It's beautiful, Stephen. It's truly beautiful." "I have something else, Mom," he continued, sitting next to me on the park bench. "Maria and Walt want to talk to you. They know I can manage the business now, but they want to know what the future holds. They respect you as the owner." I smiled. The time had come for the final reveal, the moment of true transition. The next day, I held a meeting at the newly renovated Miller Logistics headquarters. The room was full. Mr. Graham, Maria, Walt, Kevin, and Stephen. I stood at the head of the table, placing the wooden box Stephen had made on the table before me. "A year ago," I began, my voice clear and strong. "Stephen thought he owned this company. He thought he could misuse the Miller name and discard the people who built it. He failed, spectacularly." Stephen flinched, but he held my gaze. Today, Stephen stands before us as a man who knows the difference between owning a business and running a business. He has earned the respect of every person in this room. I looked at Maria, Walt, and Kevin. From this day forward, Stephen is reinstated as the managing director of Miller Logistics with a full, appropriate salary. But he reports to a newly established board. I turned back to Stephen. "I'm retiring, Stephen. I don't want to run a logistics empire, but I will not hand it back to the same arrogance that destroyed it." I slid a new document across the table. "I have established the Frank Miller Legacy Foundation. This foundation will hold the controlling 75% stake in Miller Logistics and all related properties. The foundation's mission is to provide seed funding and logistical support for retired veterans starting their own businesses." Stephen read the document, his eyes wide. "A foundation? You're using all the money. For good?" "The money was never the point, Stephen. The wealth was always meant to be a tool for good. And you, Stephen, will be the foundation's first chief operating officer, responsible for its day-to-day work. You will use your newly earned knowledge and your humbling experience to help others avoid the mistakes you made." I finished by looking directly at him. "You won't inherit the wealth, Stephen. You will manage the legacy. You will earn your worth every single day by giving back." Stephen's eyes were shining with a profound realization. He wasn't receiving a bailout. He was receiving a mission. "I accept, Mom. I accept with all my heart," he said, standing up. He walked over to me, and for the first time in over a year, he embraced me, not with the desperate cling of a drowning man, but with the secure, strong hug of a man who had found his purpose. In the end, justice hadn't been about stripping him of his assets, but stripping him of his arrogance. The most valuable thing Frank had left me wasn't the $15 million fortune. It was the perfect, loving plan to save our son. The foundation flourished, and Stephen, working alongside his mother, became a respected figure in the business world, known not for his wealth, but for his integrity. The final twist was that the retirement home gambit had saved more than one life. It had saved a family. This story shows us that the biggest inheritance a parent can leave is not money, but a powerful lesson. Diane chose education over revenge, and Stephen found his true self only after he lost everything he valued. What would you have done in Diane's place? Would you have intervened sooner, or did Stephen need to hit rock bottom to truly change? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories.